Great. So the only thing I'm going to do is introduce our first speaker again, and make sure that you have your thing. Okay. So Greg Lindsay was, I thought, an inspired choice for our first speaker because he, first of all, wrote a book that the Introduction to Urban Studies course read this fall. Andrew Brown's new class. And we all read Aerotropolis, The Way We'll Live Next, which looks at how we choose to live in this new global interconnected world. And there's some copies out on the table for those of you who want to have a look at the book. But it's really as much an exploration of our urban future as our urban present. Really very, very interesting approach to, and also sort of a biography, if you will, of John Casarda at the UNC. The cover looks like a bit like the Jetsons, as he pointed out, and that it's that kind of thinking that really can provide us with inspired urbanism. Greg is currently a visiting scholar at NYU's Rudin Center for Transportation Policy and Management, but you probably know him because he writes very frequently in some of the top periodicals and newspapers of the country. He most recently, I thought of him because he did a great piece, an op-ed in the New York Times. He writes for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, McKinsey Quarterly, World Policy Journal, Slate, and the Next American City. But he is really he's a contributing writer and seen most recently at Fast Company, which I was told is a progressive business online publication. Last spring, the architect Jean Gang asked Greg to join her team at Studio Gang Architects to participate in the MoMA exhibit that has just opened called Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. And they were charged with reimagining public housing in the future of suburbia in Cicero, and there are 5 cities in all where these imaginings took place. And Gang's team created the Garden and the Machine, which is a more flexible way of thinking about housing underpinned by new forms of ownership. So you can go see Foreclosed at MoMA through July of this year. Greg, by the way, has a Bachelor's of Science in Journalism from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Please help me welcome him to Berlin.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Let me see if I can get this going here. So as a journalist, we're always trained to show, don't tell. So I'd like to sort of open the conference, I guess, by telling you all, well, in that case, by showing you all a story. And rather than sort of telling you about sustainable urbanism. The story, you might call it a bit of a fairy tale. It begins actually in the form of a screenplay, this slab of a book called the Theale Hypothesis that was published a year ago by the Templehoyne-Buell Center at Columbia University. It was basically presented to the 5 of us, each team that was asked to participate in Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, was asked to grapple with this hypothesis, which would boil down from its 500-page form, can be boiled down to a couple of arguments. One is that all housing in America is public housing, in the sense that there are public funds that go into every home in the form of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and federally subsidized mortgages. And then therefore, we should be asked to sort of reintroduce the idea of the public back into housing. And this is sort of interpreted in several ways. One is the fact that, it's interesting that, I don't know if anyone from HUD is here yet, but but I think many in the audience would challenge the sort of suburban development model in the single-family house and argue that its time has passed. But when it comes to public housing, when we imagine that, no one questions the programs like Hope 6, which sort of replaced, the towers of Cabrini Green and Pruitt-Igoe, which proved that public housing, quote-unquote, failed. And we were asked to challenge that. And we were also asked to challenge the notion that basically all of this public money that had gone into single-family detached home suburbia, was in favor and pursuit of what's called the American dream as we know it, which is the sort of homeownership society that President Bush had talked about, and the sort of unprecedented drive to create a homeownership society, which reached about 70% in 2007, and then the crisis kicked in. And so each team was asked to reimagine public housing, not as Hope 6 single-family suburbia, not as modernist towers in the park, but to imagine something else, and in doing so, reimagine what the American dream could be. The exact challenge we were given was, if you change the dream, you change the city. And so Jeannie Gang asked me to be part of her team as we set out to sort of reimagine, not just the American dream, but reimagine what the American city could look like in a different set of circumstances following these different dreams. And so we were given the site of Cicero, Illinois. This was handed to us by MoMA. And it was interesting when you start to delve into Cicero, you realize this is not the suburbia that we've all trained to think of. This is not 1950s cul-de-sac suburbia. This is a railroad town that dates from the 1850s, actually. It was incorporated in 1870. You can see it there, I think in the middle there. It was the first suburb of outside Chicago. Literally designed, incorporated itself, of course, to escape its metropolitan authority. And that's why Al Capone set up shop there in the 1920s, to escape the long arms of the law. Here you can see a sort of aerial shot of it today. You know, other suburbs broke off, and you know that giant scar you see in the middle is actually the giant BSNF rail yards serving Cicero. Cicero was never a place you escaped to. It was always a city of industry, and it was always a place where immigrants came to find work. In the 1920s and the teens, it was immigrants from Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Poland, and they basically built brick bungalows. You know, basically single-family homes, of course, some with second kitchens, because apparently they like to cook barbarian feasts in the basement. But you know, this was basically sort of worker housing, very modest blue collar. And many of them worked here. This is the famous Western Electric plant that was built in the center of town in 1904. The population of Cicero tripled from 15,000 to 45,000 in the next decade. The Western Electric plant is actually famous. This was AT&T's sort of master factory for all the routes and switches of its network for Ma Bell, and really sort of the underpinnings of the internet. And it sort of went away. In 1984, they closed the plant in the aftermath of the AT&T breakup under the monopoly decision. And so that's what stands in the factory today. You know, big box retail. Much of the factories in Cicero that were there, you know, smelters, all sorts of heavy industry and light industry is mostly gone. There's all sorts of foreclosed factories across Cicero now as well. And so you can see when you look at it, you sort of see a suburban condition that's different than the one that we thought about for the last few years. I think when you think about the foreclosure crisis in American suburbia, by and large you think of abandoned McMansions and exurbs on the outskirts of Phoenix, places like Maricopa, Arizona. But there's another suburban crisis, and that is the plight of the inner ring suburb. You know, Brookings did a report that, a couple of years ago that basically pointed out that suburban poverty had increased by 25% in the inner ring suburbs of America between 2000 and 2008, before the foreclosure crisis even happened. And that's because the dark side, in a way, of gentrification, of the return to the city, is basically the minorities and working class are being pushed out. In Chicago census data in 2010, 250,000 people left Chicago. They were almost all African American and working class white. So even as Chicago becomes a world city in the true Saskia Assassin sense of the word, it's leading to sort of the pushing out of the core of the working class that live there into places like Cicero. Now, the story could have ended there. I mean, Cicero could have been basically a sort of dying town in a sense. Once the factory left, once Western Electric left, many of its original residents in the 1960s, the ones who so, you know, stubbornly fought against integration, basically died or they moved on. And Cicero could have been a sort of abandoned, decaying suburb. But that's not the end of the story, because in the 1980s and 1990s, the population of Cicero practically doubled again as Mexican immigrants and Central American immigrants started coming in. Cicero today, for example, is 90% Hispanic and 50% foreign-born, mostly from those handful of Mexican provinces you just saw. And so, you know, it's basically been transformed into a place of basically non-Native Americans. Many of whom are not assimilating into the American dream as we know it. As you may have read, Mexican immigration, illegal immigration is an all-time low. Many Mexicans are actually moving back now because economic opportunities in Mexico have never been better, and the U.S. situation has never been worse. But not all is well in Cicero either. At the beginning of our project, our team, we started walking down the streets, and one of the first things you notice when you start studying the bungalows very closely is that many of them have multiple mailboxes, and that many of the mailboxes have multiple names. Cicero, a number of families there basically crowd into the bungalow and divide and subdivide these because they can't afford to have their own bungalow. Which you can see, I think this next slide, you can see by the number of foreclosures. Cicero had 2,000 foreclosures in 2009. It had another 1,000 foreclosures in 2010. It was the second highest number in the state of Illinois after Chicago, which is vastly larger, nearly 100 times larger in population. And so, yeah, and you basically, led to the point where many of the residents in Cicero are considered, stressed by HUD. They spend over 30% of their income on housing. And then basically these families were forced to fit themselves to conform to the urban form of Cicero, the brick bungalow. They were squeezing and warping themselves to fit into a structure that they could still barely afford. And it stressed them beyond the limit they were willing to pay. And then you add up on this, you have basically the sort of abandoned factories of Cicero, most of which lie fallow, untreated, because of the threat of industrial contamination. Basically, it's just simply easier because of the economics of greenfield development to keep pushing out to the periphery forever. I mean, this is what we've seen in the United States since the 1960s when factories started moving to the south and then on to Mexico and China, of course. But much of that infrastructure in Cicero just sort of sits there. The rail yards are still heavily used. They now carry goods coming in from Prince Rupert Sound in Canada, bringing back those Chinese-made goods. While the factories in the north and south part of the site are simply unused and abandoned, as you saw in that earlier slide. And so when you sort of overlay these two on top of each other, you can see the sort of the challenge facing Cicero. It's trifold. It's basically a foreclosure crisis. It's an environmental crisis, and to some extent, it's also a crisis of work because the residents who live in Cicero now are working in sort of the bottom end of the American service industry, or they are construction workers who have been left, of course, high and dry by the end of the construction boom. And basically, the TOD that exists there are several train lines and bus lines, are designed to serve the loop, which of course, is a job market that's not really in the market for low-skilled Spanish-speaking Mexican immigrants. So this was sort of the challenge that we saw as our team. How do you revitalize Cicero from a job perspective? How do you encourage cottage industry and basically try to formalize the informal industries going on there? Families who are baking their own baked goods out of their kitchens, who are basically doing woodworking and basically standing by the side of the road waiting for construction vans to pick them up. How do we create some more opportunities locally because there's simply no opportunity to basically get them out of their cars onto jobs in the loop? The second part was vital remediation. How do we basically find low-cost ways to transform some of these abandoned factory sites and elsewhere back into more productive land? And then the third part was to sort of reimagine what the bungalow could be, what housing could be, and also because we didn't have to change the American dream in the case of Cicero's residents. They were dreaming a different dream altogether, a dream of opportunities for their children, a dream of remittances back to their families in Mexico, a dream that had absolutely nothing to do with the white picket fences of 1950 suburbia. So how do we come up with a new form of urbanism that furthers their dreams? And so we started, our team, when we started looking at it, was to basically think about the bungalow and think about how the bungalow was designed and how it was used. And so you have, 20th century suburbia, the Ozzie and Harriet suburban house, which if you think about it, suburbia was basically designed to be a massively redundant exercise, in which case everyone had the same facilities, everyone had the same goods, everyone had a washer dryer, everyone had a car, everyone had all of this. But the house that exists today is, of course, multi-generational, multi-family, multi-resident. They're massively subdivided. Garages aren't used to actually park cars in Cicero. That's what people use for storage, or they run workshops out of there, small businesses. Everyone parks in the streets. And then you can see the massively subdivided apartment blocks. So we started with the first premises. What if you could basically take apart the bungalow? What if you could do a la carte housing? What if you could make the house conform to the resident, to the family, rather than force them to conform to the actual bungalow itself? And so, we sort of come up with the idea of the Rubiks Cube, which is sort of a misnomer, because if you solve the Rubiks Cube, you end up with single-family suburbia. But we sort of imagined mixing it up, I guess you could say, into the sort of varied environment, where basically you could have various families, various uses, all sorts of sort of combinations of live and work, and really sort of recognizing how these homes were actually used, rather than pretending that it's still the suburban form we know. So what we did is we took a sort of radical step where we tried to imagine a new urban structure that could basically conform, that could adapt over time, and could grow and expand or shrink to meet the uses and the sizes of the families who live there. And so we came up with what we call the vertical neighborhood, because Of course, if you do some vertical stacking, you can achieve greater density. And so what we imagined was not necessarily prefab and not shipping containers and not modular, but imagine you could actually sort of extend and build onto this environment all the time. It would be constantly changing and constantly morphing because residents would be able to buy homes a la carte. You would buy as many rooms as you needed. You could buy your own kitchen and bathroom, or you could share in communal facilities. And many Latino families in Cicero, as it turns out, share communal kitchens already at their interfaith centers, at their churches, in many conditions. And so we sort of tried to imagine, how are they using their homes already, and how can we sort of adapt it onto this, where you could basically buy all that you needed, rather than buying a brick bungalow with more rooms than you had. And so what we decided to do from a practical sense in doing this project for MoMA, rather than start bulldozing huge chunks of bungalows, which I think like Corbusier would have done, we basically took over a factory itself. And we imagined that we could basically sort of take one of these abandoned factories or factories on the verge of foreclosure, as this one was, and use its bones as sort of the template for our site, for a recombinant house. And so you can sort of see, this is sort of the interiors of the factory itself, all these steel trusses. Again, here's our sort of site. You can see our site of the factories in the foreground. There's the loop in the distance. And again, these are the conditions. It's right next to the BNSFF rail yards, and then sort of the other properties nearby. And so what we imagine is we would start taking this factory apart over time. This would be a process that could last 5 or 10 years. And the first thing we would do is we would try to phytoremediate the soils. This is a term that's come into vogue in landscape architecture and ecological. It's basically using various varieties of plants and trees to basically suck heavy metals out of the soil. It turns out that poplars and willows are actually able to basically draw out all sorts of metals, including lead and even radioactive ones to an extent, and store them in their trunks. They basically become living containment units. And so we imagine that you could plant these for 5 to 6 years, and they could start pulling out and doing much of the heavy lifting and remediation rather than stripping off all the topsoil as normally done. And so what you do is you'd have to take those out, and of course you could never log them. So we replant them along the sort of train corridor and start using them as a buffer to basically keep citizens sheltered. And so imagine something like this, where you're coexisting with the rail yard as much as possible. And then of course over time, we try to start extending that and basically adding green to the Cicero neighborhoods out of there. You'd add plants and withdraw them, and then eventually start constructing the elements of the vertical house. And one thing we imagine, of course, with this is that many Mexican families, of course, grow up around the notion, and Latin families grow up around the notion of the plaza and of a form of public space that doesn't really exist in suburbia. And so we imagine what we would do is instead of forcing people to give up their single-family homes, we would try to lure them out with the amenities that don't exist in single-family use suburbia. And so basically we imagined, in the footprint of our factory would be plazas, would be markets, would be a whole new program of urbanism that doesn't really exist in Cicero now. And so over time, you'd add features like car share. We would add workshops that basically you could use as services. And we would add, sort of water treatment and basically add more plants. You can sort of see as it grows over time. We try to activate the alleyways of Cicero, which aren't really used now because no one parks their cars in the grove, as I mentioned. So we imagine that the alleys could eventually become the sort of new streets. So this is sort of an overhead view. You can see at the top there is where we imagine some of the vertical housing. But all this in here is sort of workshops with solar panels and community gardens, schools, trying to reimagine a whole sort of new program that an authority, that some sort of basically sort of land trust could administer. And so, you can see some of the features here: a biodigester to basically recycle a lot of things on site, stormwater remediation. Because of this as an exercise, we were trying to bring as many functions as we could into this building for sort of central administration under our authority. And because basically what you use is to help pay for upkeep is that you basically sort of charge for services to various residents and sort of use that to keep expanding the program. And so, in terms of construction, one thing we imagine is that the factories themselves in Cicero, that there's already so much abandoned urbanism and construction in inner-ring industrial suburbs, that you could basically start taking apart these factories as sort of the first source of employment and as sort of the raw materials for building these sort of new housing structures. So just sort of an in-depth look here. We imagine you build concrete cores of the vertical house and you'd sort of extend the street into them. So you'd have sort of plazas running through the whole building itself as these units are built out over time. Sort of give you an idea what it looks like in the end. But again, coming back to sort of the environmental side of it, one thing we try to do is sort of imagine as many closed loops as possible within our program. So one is materials, one is actually sort of taking apart nearby factories, recycling them, processing them, churning out cleansed materials that could possibly be reused in building elsewhere. One of the things they imagine is having a brewery on site. So you sort of take the used hops from the brewery and then feed it to the biodigester for heat on site. All sorts of different things you can do. Again, you can do it with food, basically trying to grow crops on site and in community gardens. And then again, sort of recycling that as well. Having farmers markets essentially on site and trying to encourage as much local production as possible, both from a jobs perspective and just a sort of community perspective. And then of course the final part was water. I mean, try to have wastewater recycling on site and try to sort of use the resources that exist. Now, of course, we ran into a problem, and that's why this is actually a story and somewhat of a fairy tale. Is because everything we proposed in Cicero, Illinois was incredibly illegal under their zoning code. Everything. And because this is partly because of the legacy of Cicero. I mean, Cicero, Illinois, of course, is famous for the 1960s. Martin Luther King was afraid to march in Cicero. And Jesse Jackson actually did. And the peaceful march descended into rioting when the residents threw bricks and bottles, and then the protesters started fighting back. And to many ways, that legacy still exists today. There's actually in the zoning code attempts to define what a family is. To limit the number of people who could live in the homes. And so when we set out to do our project, we slashed and burned the zoning code. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, one thing we arrived at that I would have thought, because someone who's written about New Urbanism, of course, New Urbanism tried to approach the single-family suburbia by proposing its own form-based codes and its own sort of ultimately rigid in a good sense, attempting to basically really define the elements of good urbanism so no developer could mess it up. And we sort of reached the opposite conclusion in the sense that basically zoning, we tried to tear out as much zoning as possible to allow Cicero's immigrant community to define their homes however they wish, to expand their garages and to basically add rooms if they needed to the bungalows and not just our own facilities. And then the final piece, let's sort of give you a superimposition here of how we added to it and how we sort of changed it. And this again sort of shows what we tried to do with the alleyways, where we tried to imagine the alleys rezoned as commercial and even light industrial, where we thought the garages could become sort of small production factories and places where people could be encouraged to run businesses out of their homes, rather than the giant, sort of industrial corridors around the railroads. And then the final piece in our imagining was imagining new forms of ownership, because the financial piece of it, of course, in the end is what really matters in American housing. I mean, there's the famous Chris Lineberger at Brookings came up with the whole notion of there's 19 product types that Wall Street will finance in commercial real estate. And if you're not one of them, you'll never be able to tap into the financial markets. So what we tried to do was basically, if you have a la carte housing, how do you have a la carte pricing? How do we solve the whole notion of families that are underwater on their mortgages and trapped in place? And so what we did is, that model already existed. We turned to the community land trust model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which has been around since the 1960s. And so we created a limited equity co-op, where basically if you buy into the garden machine, you're not buying your actual rooms, you're buying shares of the co-op. And you can continue to buy shares corresponding to the rooms you own. And then basically, we take the value of the land away from you. You can never participate in the upside of land valuation, or the valuation of the garden itself, of whatever services we add and whatever we add to it. So gentrification never takes place. Basically you can't participate in the upside of your value, but you don't get trapped in place either. You can never be underwater on it. We decided to sort of take away the casino aspect of American housing. And so in the end, what happens is that basically the trust will always buy your apartment back from you, will buy your rooms back from you. And so that was meant to be a way to sort of solve the underwaterness of it. You always would have liquidity. You could always move back to Mexico or move on from there. It would be interesting to sort of apply it. Community land trusts are actually, they've been around, as I said, since '68. There's 200 or 300 in America, but the city of Chicago in 2006 created one meant to be the largest in the United States. They're still expanding theirs. You're going to hear from Brian Leary tomorrow. The Atlanta Beltline has just started one. There's famous ones in Burlington and in Berkeley, Boston, and so forth. So we sort of imagine that as a sort of core piece of our project as well. So this is sort of the final sort of encapsulation of that, how we try to bring these all together. And these are some of the renderings we have. When you look at it at night, it makes me want to move there, to be honest. And that's sort of what we imagine. This is sort of the final version. To me, this is always the inspiring way of thinking of it. You're not actually in the project. You are in one of the alleys leading to the actual site. And as soon as I saw this image when I had it, I always thought, oh, this is going to be a success because it looks just like Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Sort of framed it this way. So it's one other thing of the story here, and I guess this sort of ties back into the transportation. You know, how do we take this beyond, you know, a fairy tale of a bunch of architects, urban planners, and journalists, and others who concoct this for the Museum of Modern Art? I think Kate had said it well. You know, how do we move beyond a small group of people who think they can solve urbanism? I think she discussed our team right there. And so, you know, we start with there is the opportunity in Cicero and so many other places with the trains. I mean, they are not an afterthought here. They're not something that necessarily you want to shield. And so, you know, where the real story of Cicero begins is here. There's a group in Chicago called the Center for Neighborhood Technology. They've imagined a new form of TOD they call cargo-oriented development, which is to basically preserve, you know, the industrial rail lines on the south side of Chicago, at the center, and here in Cicero, and basically preserve those industrial commons and those jobs, and don't let houses encroach on them in residential, and don't let them gentrify, but to really recognize that is a source of jobs, a source of blue-collar labor, a source of industrial skills that people can really move into. And basically they should be protected, which they have in Chicago, and then expanded upon, because if you don't, those distribution centers get expanded somewhere down here, or well below, near where I grew up in Kankakee, Illinois, where basically gigantic intermodal freight yards are built, and trucks basically are shunted to the outside of the city, adding vehicle miles and gasoline and everything else. So we need to take steps to, you know, preserve that rail. And you know, this is the first project that they did in Chicago. This is Harvey and Blue Island on the south side. And they basically, you can sort of see here, you know, there's brownfield redevelopment sites all along where the rail yards are, where basically you can try to remediate that contaminated land, either through phytoremediation or however, to basically bring back fallow land and into useful industrial sites, sort of what you do in Cicero. And so, you know, here's Cicero and the sites they identified. They are actually now working with the government of Cicero, trying to help them apply for grants for TOD, because there is some light rail here. This is a pink line of the loop, and this is a commuter rail line here at the rail yards, and trying to bring them around to it. But you know, it's interesting with Cicero. We've been asked, our team, a couple times if we plan to work with them, and we sort of awkwardly laugh and say no, because it really shows that what's really needed is leadership in this. I mean, the town government of Cicero, they have every intention of fighting for their single-family homes to the death. And it's funny, they've actually, you know, their idea is to, as you can see here, you know, their idea of the new Cicero, as they call it, is to basically turn these industrial sites into big box retail and try to increase their tax rolls that way. And they've actually imagined creating some mixed-use housing for quote-unquote Chicago doctors and lawyers in a cynical play to basically bring a piece of gentrification to their door and then basically sort of add that to their tax rolls. So their goal is to basically, maybe we can prey on some of these yuppies while we preserve our single-family homes. That appears to be their strategy. So I don't know if they can be talked sense into this, but it does strike me that, you know, there are opportunities out there. And again, you'll hear from Brian there tomorrow, but you know, we're actually going to have a conversation with the Beltline folks about this, because, you know, the Beltline, this is 22 miles of rail all around Atlanta, most of it abandoned, but, you know, you can see that they have very ambitious plans to activate some of it. And they formed their own CLT, and they plan to put in their own transit. And I think there are real-life opportunities across America, Atlanta being one, to really sort of realize the story that we try to tell and really sort of bring about the sort of sustainable urbanism, you know, that is, you know, sustainable for immigrants. You know, America's going to add 100 million America's going to add another 100 million residents by 2050, mostly immigrants. We do need ways to accommodate them and find affordable housing, and then of course incorporate them into more sustainable green urbanism in the core. And so, yes, so I'm hoping this story will help sort of frame some of the issues that you're going to hear about over the next day and a half, and really sort of hopefully lead to a grand reality. So with that, please, Scott Wolf, who's going to respond.
I just want to introduce our next speaker, who is one of a number of local notables who will be participating in the conference over this next 2 days. And we're also very fortunate because he's playing two roles, not just the local person, but also the Brown alum who's going to be on each of, there will be alumni in each of the panels. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Scott Wolf, who is the, officially, are you the executive? Yeah, executive director of GrowSmart, Rhode Island. where he has been working since March of 1999. And GrowSmart, as you'll hear tomorrow as well, GrowSmart has received a large number of awards for its innovative work with trying to combine precisely these comprehensive elements to make more livable our cities. In addition to directing GrowSmart, Scott has does serve on the Providence Zoning Board and the board of Smart Growth America, which is the Smart Growth Movement's national organization. For over 30 years, Scott Wolf has transformed opinion by effective communication and legislative strategies for progressive policy organizations, media outlets, and elected officials and candidates. From 95 to 99, Scott was the executive director of the 98 Project, a national issue education organization focused on Congress's agenda and various ballot initiatives. He also directed the Rhode Island Governor's Office of Housing, Energy, and Intergovernmental Relations, which again presages some of the themes that we're exploring. And he ran Scott Wolf and Associates, a political and public policy consulting firm. He's a veteran community and political activist, and he ran for Congress twice from Rhode Island, all strongly challenging two incumbents. And earlier in his career, he worked for the Democratic Party's National Research and Communications Office and efforts, and was a public opinion analyst. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1975 from Brown. Please welcome Scott Wolf.
When I graduated, Brown was a lot easier to navigate than I think it is today. But, I have fond memories. I thought that Greg's talk was terrific. I have some prepared remarks, but I do want to be a little free form at the outset and just touch on a few of the things that he emphasized. Starting with the whole issue of the rigidity and counterintuitivity, if you will, of zoning. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of zoning in America. I do not claim to be an expert, but I do know that zoning really came about as a common way of regulating land uses in the early 1900s, and to some extent it was a response to the industrialization going on in the country and to the concern about the public health being endangered by having so many residences in such close proximity to factories and heavy industry. So the initial thrust of zoning was to separate and segregate land uses as opposed to mix them. And we are dealing in 2012 with that legacy, and it's not a very happy legacy for those of us who promote mixed-use, walkable, transit-friendly neighborhoods and communities. And I am on the Providence Zoning Board, as Professor Silver mentioned. I've been serving on that board for 7 years. And one of the main functions of a zoning board is to review requests for exceptions to the zoning ordinance, to in effect work around the rules of the zoning code. And I am proud to say that I grant about 80 to 90% of the requests for variances that come before me. But the reason, it's unfortunate we have to have so many cases. The reason I think we have so many cases is the code is still outdated, outmoded, and way too rigid, way too prescriptive, and not providing anywhere near the regulatory flexibility that Greg was trying to achieve in Cicero. So I am a strong advocate for more for zoning that promotes rather than constrains mixed-use development and transit-friendly and walkable kinds of communities. Another thing that Greg mentioned, and it struck a responsive chord with me regarding what's happened in Providence recently, was some discussion you engaged in about the industrial activity that still may exist in Cicero and different viewpoints about how to deal with it, whether encourage it or whether to gentrify and sort of displace it. And those of you who are from Providence area, I think would agree with me that there are echoes of that debate in the debate about the working waterfront in Providence. That seems to have somewhat, that debate seems to have died down and I think been largely resolved in favor of continuing to have a working waterfront that is pretty much a use that is not contaminated, if you will, by hotels and upscale apartment buildings, et cetera. I will say, talking about a problem of cities, one of the dilemmas that a city like Providence faces is it's got a different perspective on what makes it financially viable than the state in which it's located. The state government of Rhode Island is primarily interested in generating income tax revenue and sales tax revenue. Those are the two biggest sources of funding, gambling being the third largest source for the state. The city of Providence gets the vast majority of its revenue from property taxes. The working waterfront in Providence is not a big generator of property tax revenue for the city. It's a pretty large swath of land, given the relatively small size of Providence, and it doesn't generate a lot of property tax revenue because the land is arguably maybe not, and it's being used in its highest and best way. That's what some people would argue. So it's not valued highly. If you had condos and hotels and bars and that whole scene there, the city's feeling for a long time was, well, we could get a lot more tax revenue out of that. From a state perspective, you've got some of the best paying blue collar jobs left in Rhode Island on the working waterfront. That's income tax. It's also just generally good from a state economic development standpoint. They don't want to crowd those folks out in favor of a bunch of yuppies who aren't living in the area and who already have opportunities. So, it's a classic case of where promoting the interests of a city sometimes come into conflict with what are at least the perceived interests of some of the larger governmental jurisdictions in which the city is located. So those are a few off the top responses and observations to I think what was an excellent and very visionary talk by you, Greg. I want to talk a little bit about GrowSmart Rhode Island and about what we're trying to do here in the state of Rhode Island. I don't have any nice slides, I apologize, but bear with me. GrowSmart Rhode Island is a public policy organization where we're committed to promoting sustainable and equitable economic growth in Rhode Island through the nurturing of what we consider to be our high quality of place and through a conscious public policy tilt in favor of urban living and urban redevelopment. We are committed to making urban redevelopment as economically feasible and aesthetically attractive as so-called greenfield development. One of the kind of deep, dark secrets of growth and development in the U.S., and it's really not such a secret any longer, over the last 100 years, well, over the last 60, 70 years or so, is that there have been a lot of subsidies in place, implicit and explicit subsidies, to promote suburban sprawl, to promote people leaving the cities, and through cheap transportation and certain kinds of zoning, making it much more feasible to do so-called greenfield development in outlying areas than to redevelop existing infrastructure and buildings in the city. So we come at smart growth from the perspective that the deck has been stacked against urban redevelopment and against creative urban placemaking in this country for the last half century at least, and that we need a set of incentives and tools to at least even up the odds for urban redevelopment and urban placemaking. And so that's why we support things like a state historic tax credit, which is generally used to make it economically feasible to redevelop in Rhode Island our huge collection of historic mill and factory buildings that have environmental contamination problems often and that are pretty daunting kinds of facilities to try to redevelop without some significant subsidy. So if you're a developer who's looking to develop some space for businesses, and you've got the choice between plowing out some farmland in Exeter, Rhode Island, a land that's valued probably at much lower cost than the land in Providence, or looking at a factory building with brownfield contamination issues and deterioration to the nth degree, and trying to redevelop that, the default option you're most likely to take, unless there's some intervention in the marketplace, is to go to Exeter and plow up the farmland for some business space. So we do feel that it's not, we don't feel that we're not anti-free market, by the way, but we think the market has been far from free when it comes to determining patterns of development, and that there's got to be some equilibrium established to promote this kind of smarter, what we consider to be more sustainable development. Now, I think there are probably 5 trends right now going on in our country and to some extent in the world, but definitely in our country, that are making smart growth and sustainable urbanism much more feasible and much more attractive, even to organizations and people who have no passion for urbanism. And one of the, I think the leading of these 5 trends is the end of the era of cheap oil. When gasoline costs $1.80, $1.50 a gallon, the idea, to be very parochial and local, of living in Narragansett, Rhode Island, 30 miles from downtown Providence, and commuting every day to Providence, was not at all daunting. It was quite attractive. Narragansett has lower taxes than Providence, and it's right on the ocean, and gasoline at $1.50 a gallon, what the hell? You'd be in great shape. But now, people think a little more about that same kind of scenario when gasoline is $4 a gallon. So that simple change, not so simple, but that change in the pricing of fossil fuels, particularly oil, gasoline, is a significant prod for re-urbanizing our country. And for people who never thought before about living in an urban environment, suddenly viewing it as a realistic option. Another thing that I think is making sustainable urbanism much more feasible and attractive is demographic changes and trends. The portion of the American population, adult population, that lives in households without school-aged children is growing dramatically in this country right now. And I don't have the exact figures in my head, but I think less than 1 out of 4 households in America right now have children of school age. And the reason why that's important is we still have, in many cities, sort of an urban education challenge. And a lot of adults with school-age children tend to flee to the suburbs when their kids become of school age because of either real or imagined concerns about the quality of education their kids are going to get in the cities. But that's now almost like a little niche market. You've got other markets, and I'm not saying this is a reason to abandon the struggle to reform and improve our urban education system. I think that's still critical to the epigee of wonderful urbanism, is to have better urban education systems. But as we transition, hopefully, to better urban education systems, we've got this set of demographic trends that are making urban living a real viable option for a healthy chunk of the population. To be a little more specific, you've got people delaying marriage and delaying really coupling up well into their late 20s or early 30s, so you've got a whole youth market for urban living. You've got folks my age and older, empty nest syndrome, who wants to mow a 2-acre lawn and have a 30-mile commute when the kids are out of the house and you're not quite as vibrant and full of joy about spending 3 hours on a Sunday mowing your lawn. So, and I'm part of the baby boom generation. We obviously are a huge block of people, and we have tremendous influence on the economic marketplace of America. Then you've got people even older than us, people who are really elderly people, a big and growing part of the U.S. population. and a healthier slice of the U.S. population than they used to be. These are often active folks in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. They're active, but they're not kids, and they don't want to drive 20 miles to their doctor's appointments or drive 20 miles to access cultural activities and art exhibits and do their financial transactions. So urban living is very attractive to a lot of people in that segment as well. So these demographic shifts are very significant in making the case for smart growth and sustainable urbanism. I think another trend is the obesity epidemic and the reaction against the obesity epidemic and the concern about how do we enable Americans to lead more healthy and fitter lives. And that's a case for urbanism as well. Some of the healthiest people in America, at least in terms of fitness, are people who live in Manhattan. I mean, Manhattanites walk more than almost anybody in America. It's kind of ironic. People flee to the outlying areas because they think it's healthier and it's a cleaner environment, and in some ways it is, but those folks tend to be heavier and tend to be less fit than the folks who live in the center of our cities. So as this concern increases, again, sustainable urbanism becomes a much more marketable concept. I think another thing that is helping, or should help, sustainable urbanism flourish is the bursting of the housing bubble and the re-examination that's causing, and Greg alluded to this, as to what is the American dream and what do people really want in terms of residential space and residential environment. What is, I think, quite intriguing about this latest housing downturn is that the residences that have tended to lose the most value are residences in ex-urban locations, in the locations that are 20, 30 miles outside of a downtown core large American city. The homes and condos closer to the center of major American cities have lost much less value on average than those on the outskirts. So there's a message being sent that not only may it be more inviting to live in a city just from an aesthetic and activity standpoint and lack of hassle standpoint, but it might be a better investment to buy a home in the city than in an exurb. And I think another thing that's happened with the economic downturn is municipalities, particularly in this part of the country, are struggling, and they're looking for ways to save money and to be more efficient. Regionalization is still a hard thing to sell, but the idea of trying to encourage mixed use and trying to encourage denser development for smart municipal officials is the way to go, because it's easier to deliver services efficiently in a dense mixed-use environment than in a sprawling 2-acre lot kind of environment. So these are all trends that are with us today and that I think are making the case for sustainable urbanism. I just wanted to make a couple more points if I have time to do so.
2 or 3 minutes.
Very good, okay. Just going back to a little bit of history, I mentioned about the subsidies for sprawl, and I want to just leave you with a few of the specific things that have happened in this country over the last 50, 60 years that have subsidized sprawl. The federal highway program was a huge subsidy for sprawl. The banks redlining a lot of urban impoverished or lower income neighborhoods so that they wouldn't give out any loans to people looking for homeownership opportunities. That was another subsidy for sprawl in effect. You have the whole urban renewal programs of the 50s and 60s that in many ways were urban removal programs. They destroyed, in many cases, intact urban neighborhoods and again contributed to the out-migration from the city. So there have been a number of policies that many of them have had unintended consequences that have contributed to sprawl, and I think the time is ripe to reassert the role of cities in our economic and social well-being. And I also think that there are a lot of practical reasons right now why even the folks who have no real stake in urbanism or think they don't should be supporting a robust urban environment. So good luck with the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.
I'm hoping that we have a time for at least 2 or 3 questions. Are there any out there? Any questions for us? Okay, so thank you very much. Oh, there is one.
Yeah. So, Mr. Wolf, first of all, thank you both for speaking. But you talked about how you're proud that you grant so many variances, which means the zoning code isn't really working as is.
Right. Yeah, it's a good news, bad news situation.
Right,
Yeah.
and you kind of, I mean, you speak of like these big dynamic developments, and also people that are really resisting it because they want single-family homes. So my question is like, what is the ideal zoning code that will allow people to have these single-family homes and also let these like creative, dynamic developments happen?
Well, that's an excellent question. I don't necessarily have an excellent answer, but I do think codes that are not as prescriptive, as detailed as the ones we have now. I think form-based codes in some cases are preferable to the Euclidean kind of zoning that we're still stuck with. So I think to allow form to follow function in the way we zone, more opportunity for mixed use, for mixing of uses is certainly something that is critical. And even in a city like Providence, and we're not unique, there's a lot of single-use zoning on the books still, where you can't have a mix of uses. In fact, if you tried to rebuild the most charming neighborhoods in Providence and in other parts of Rhode Island today, you'd be prohibited by law from doing so.
And that's true across America. I remember like Santa Fe was burned down. In 1619, you couldn't rebuild it legally in America. Well, one thing I'd like to add that slipped my mind during my talk, and I thought of it during Scott, and I think hopefully we'll frame some of the other discussions is that when the exhibit started at MoMA, we had the 5 teams. MoMA told us we had basically superhuman powers. We could go back in time. The exhibit is actually set technically in an alternate America. We're in February, I believe it was February 28th, 2009, or late February, the day after Obama presented his stimulus plan was the day he basically made his big move on housing. $250 million went to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so MoMA invited us to basically reimagine from that point forward. We could do anything with the stimulus. We could do anything. We could pass $1 trillion stimulus. We could imagine a high-speed rail network from coast to coast. We could literally do anything within the realm of reason. And none of the teams touched this power. If you see the exhibit or read anything about it, you'll see it has been lambasted by critics and some accounts for being unrealistic and being unfeasible formally from an architectural perspective. One team, for example, tore up all the streets in a town in New Jersey and built housing on former streets. But no one could even grapple with the idea that we could basically rewrite policy from scratch, that we could redirect funding any way we wanted to. And it was just interesting that basically we were prisoners of our own minds when it came to reimagining different policies for America that way. And so it's incredibly difficult, even when given the powers, to imagine what can be realistic when it comes to reimagining what we can do with urbanism, because people will attack you for trying to destroy the American way of life. I hope, by the way, that someone brings up Agenda 21, the supposed conspiracy by the United Nations to take us out of our homes and replace it with his communist-style walkable urbanism. So you've been warned.
We have time for just one more question, okay?
Yeah. Hi. I have a bit of a Providence-specific question. Brown's been doing a lot of expansion to the Knowledge District and the Jewelry District, where academic institutions like Meds and Eds are the early investors hoping to bring in for their industry. What do you think of the scope for this kind of development?
Well, I think overall it's a very positive trend for the city. I think it raises some concerns about is the land going to be, and the building, are they going to be tax exempt, or is Brown going to pay taxes on them? And obviously that's something that's being debated, deliberated upon quite a bit. But I do think that in Providence and in many American cities, the Meds and Eds complex is a major current driver and potentially a major future driver of economic growth and activity. I hope you heard what I said before that. So I think, I mean, I know one of the things that the city of Providence and the state of Rhode Island is wrestling with right now is how much of the land that's been freed up by the relocation of I-195 should be in effect granted to nonprofit meds and eds institutions, or should we be waiting for private investors to come in? My gut is you're not going to get private investors to come in from the get-go on that land. You're going to need to have some meds and eds folks be the trailblazers there, and hopefully they'll pay. The city can reach an agreement with them so they'll be paying taxes on that property and that land. But meds and eds is a great opportunity for Providence, and we can't dismiss it. And I think that you're already seeing a lot of private spin-offs from the concentration of meds and eds in the so-called knowledge district. So I'm pretty bullish on it. I'll give you a quick little anecdote. There's a guy named Ken Hecht, who's a developer from Boston. He's just purchased 95 Chestnut Street, which is one of the buildings in the knowledge district. And I don't think he's done any development or property ownership activity in Providence prior to purchasing this facility recently. I've had an opportunity to talk to him a few times. He thinks, despite all the negative headlines, despite all the problems Providence is facing, that Providence and that knowledge district in particular are ready to really explode in a positive way. And he's looking to invest in additional buildings in that area. So I think that's a pretty good barometer of what our potential upside is. And he's certainly catering to the so-called knowledge economy institutions and industries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another panel. We're running a little bit behind schedule, and so I hope you'll all join me in thanking both Craig and Scott for a very interesting You'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions a little later.